Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to break down how Gattuso won the tactical battle over Maurizio Sarri to shut down Juventus and win the Coppa Italia. When we break it all down, we do look at the board. We have Juventus in a 4-3-3, and we end up seeing Napoli shift into more of a 4-1-4-1. What was different here with Napoli was that against Inter Milan, they really struggled out in the wider areas, specifically with the movement of Candreva bombing forward, and that was based on the fact that Insigne and Politano were doing a very poor job in tracking those runs. However, when we look to this game, that was a different scenario for those Napoli wider players. When we look at how Gattuso set up his side, he wanted Mertens to sit ahead of Pjanic, which meant that De Ligt and Bonucci were able to push forward. Zielinski and Fabian Ruiz also did a job of stepping forward to close down the spare center backs when Mertens was stepping to one. For instance, if you did see Mertens step into the path of Bonucci, then Zielinski would step forward to close down De Ligt and vice versa. If Mertens is towards De Ligt, then you would see Fabian Ruiz look to push closer to Bonucci to ensure that he couldn't push forward and offer penetration from those deeper areas. But out in the wider areas, he had Callejon stepping into the path of Alexandro when he looked to push forward. And out on the right-hand side, it was Insigne against Cuadrado. While on paper, down that left-hand side, that could look like a weak point for Napoli based off the fact that Cuadrado is naturally an attacking player, and Insigne simply doesn't want to track that movement. What we ended up seeing from Insigne in that game was that he was doing a very good job of ensuring that Cuadrado couldn't join Douglas Costa to link play and overload Mario Rui. Out in that midfield zone, the battle was pretty much set. You had Zielinski and Fabian Ruiz stepping out into the path of Matuidi and Bentancur to track that movement, and Diego Demme did a very good job of breaking up play ahead of that back four, tracking movements out into the channels, and ensuring that Dybala couldn't drop into that zone to get on the ball. And while Napoli deserved credit for doing their individual duties on the defensive end, what was key about this performance was that they defended well as a unit. When you go across Juve's attacking zones, you end up seeing that there was no real passing lane or real legitimate goal threat for Juventus throughout that game. What you end up seeing is that down the left-hand side, it is Ronaldo against Lorenzo, but Callejon was doing a very good job of dropping off deeper to ensure that it always was 1v2, and if Alexandro looked to push forward on the overlap, then that was a situation that Napoli were comfortable with. When you look to Ronaldo dropping off a bit deeper in a narrow position, then what you'd end up seeing was that he would be closed down by Callejon and Fabian Ruiz, and with Alexandro overlapping, then he's closed down by Di Lorenzo. Ronaldo struggled to gain any sort of advantage down that left-hand side, so we often saw him drifting centrally into a gap in between Di Lorenzo and Maksimovic. But even in that zone, if Juventus were able to get balls into him in that box, it was solely Ronaldo as the aerial threat in that box. And frankly, against Koulibaly, Maksimovic, and Di Lorenzo, Ronaldo is at a disadvantage. Meanwhile, when we look to the right-hand side, Douglas Costa encountered similar issues against Mario Rui. Napoli coped well in that zone with Insigne dropping off to help out Mario Rui. And there was a time where Douglas Costa was looking to break down that right-hand side, and he was closed down by Mario Rui, Insigne, and Zielinski shifting over, which epitomizes the work rate and the organization that we got from Gattuso's Napoli side. However, there was an outlet for Cuadrado to find passes in between Insigne and Zielinski for Dybala dropping off deeper. The problem here is that when Dybala looked to receive that ball, he was often boxed in. You end up seeing Zielinski and Insigne ahead of him, but then you have Mario Rui and Demme shifting over with Koulibaly having the option to push forward, given the fact that there's no attacking threat besides Ronaldo in and around that box, and that's when Di Lorenzo can shift over to help out Maksimovic to ensure that Ronaldo is in a 1v2 situation. Then we get to the center of the pitch where Matuidi and Bentancur didn't offer much, as they were often sitting in between the wide player and the shuttler to try and get on the ball. But if we look to a few examples, we could break down just just how good Napoli was out of possession. When we look to one example, you have Ronaldo ahead of Di Lorenzo and Callejon, and what you end up seeing here is that Fabian Ruiz does get attracted to the ball, and Matuidi looks to make a run off him into that gap so that Ronaldo could play him in. But what you end up seeing here is that Demme calls off Fabian Ruiz, and he shifts over to track that movement of Matuidi. So with Demme blocking off that passing lane in towards Matuidi, Ronaldo is now forced to play the ball back to Alexandro, who ultimately gives the ball away to Fabian Ruiz, and that is a good example as to how Napoli were able to shut down that left-hand side. When we look to another example, now we'll highlight Dybala's movement in and around that final third. We end up seeing him shift out to the right-hand zone, and when Cuadrado looks to step forward, he ends up squaring the ball into the path of Pjanic ahead of Mertens. When Pjanic receives the ball, he ends up splitting Mertens and Zielinski for the run of Dybala off Insigne, but Insigne continues to track that movement of Dybala, and Demme steps in to ensure that Dybala can't receive the ball and move forward between those lines. And that's another example of how Napoli as a unit were shutting down Juventus. While Juventus struggled to create chances in that opening half, without the ball, they did a good job of stifling Napoli from building out of the back. They had Ronaldo and Dybala ahead of the center backs, but in between Demme to ensure that he couldn't get on the ball. Douglas Costa was shifted out towards that left-hand side, looking to close down Mario Rui. And then you ended up having the shuttlers ready to push forward out to the fullbacks if they needed to get on the ball. So if you ended up having Di Lorenzo get on the ball, that would force out Matuidi, then Pjanic would step into the path of Fabian Ruiz, and that's how Juventus were able to stifle Napoli in their own zone and force them to play long. Later on in that game, we actually ended up seeing Pjanic push forward in towards Demme trying to split the center backs, but that also worked to a T and it forced Napoli out into those wider areas. Without the ball, if they dropped off a bit deeper, they were simply in two banks of four with Matuidi and Douglas Costa out in those wider zones. And the only real threat that Napoli did pose from open play was through the movement of Fabian Ruiz receiving the ball in between the Ronaldo and Matuidi gap or the Matuidi and Pjanic gap. When we look to one example, we end up seeing Maksimovic push forward from center back, and he ends up splitting Ronaldo and Dybala and Pjanic and Matuidi to find Fabian Ruiz. Ruiz ends up dropping off that ball between Matuidi and Pjanic into the path of Demme, and Demme looks to slide the ball wide into the path of Di Lorenzo pushing forward. When Di Lorenzo receives the ball, it forces Matuidi and Alexandro towards him, and he ends up poking it in between them for Fabian Ruiz at the center of the pitch, and Ruiz instantly looks to wrap the ball across Sandro for Di Lorenzo continuing his run, but Alexandro does a good job of covering that play. When we look to another example, it's Maksimovic again stepping forward, this time splitting Ronaldo and Matuidi to find Fabian Ruiz in that gap. And before Pjanic can get across to close down Fabian Ruiz, he ends up sliding the ball across Pjanic into the path of Zielinski, who is ahead of Bentancur, who eventually does foul him, and that foul leads to the Insigne free kick that hits off the post. But what you can see from Ruiz here is the fact that he was willing to vary his movement into those gaps in that Juventus midfield to get his teammates into good positions in the final third, but they simply were unable to make the most of it. But even when we look to the second half, there wasn't much improvement from either side tactically. Juventus was consistently trying to play through Douglas Costa, but he was struggling to get the better of Mario Rui, and we did see more of Cuadrado pushing into advanced positions, but Insigne did a very good job of closing down that danger. Meanwhile, when we look to Napoli, it was still Fabian Ruiz's movement that was getting them into good positions in open play. When we look to one example, we end up seeing Matuidi shifting into the path of Di Lorenzo on the ball, and we have Callejon shifting towards the touchline to drag out Alexandro. What Di Lorenzo ends up doing is that he wraps the ball around Matuidi and he ends up splitting Pjanic and Alexandro to find Fabian Ruiz running off Pjanic. When Fabian Ruiz receives that ball, he is encountered by Bonucci, and he simply pokes the ball across him for Mertens running across De Ligt, but De Ligt does a good job of sweeping up that danger. But even when we look to how both managers look to their bench, we did see Danilo come on for Douglas Costa, which ended up seeing Cuadrado push forward, but he didn't improve Juventus's overall attack. Whereas Gattuso brought on Milik and Politano to replace Callejon and Mertens, and although they didn't improve Napoli's attack from an open play standpoint, they were involved in several opportunities to kill off the game in normal time, but they failed to do so. When you break down that game as a whole, Napoli were the better side here. They were defensively organized, tactically disciplined, and their work rate was tidy and efficient. Gattuso's overall tactics here was to limit and shut down Juventus's overall threat in the final third, and he did that to a T. And when you look at it from an offensive standpoint, Napoli did create the better chances, and if it wasn't for the brilliance of Gigi Buffon, Napoli would have won this game in normal time. So when you really do assess it, Gattuso won the tactical battle over Maurizio Sarri here, and frankly, Napoli were deserved winners of the Coppa Italia. Hi everybody, thanks for watching, and subscribe here for your latest tactical analysis and daily commentary on the InnerViews show. And if that wasn't enough, don't forget you could find more organic, unfiltered soccer/football analysis on the InnerViews podcast, the best soccer/football podcast in the world, available on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and any Android apps on your Android devices.